All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. At least here in Nebraska, it's pretty nice outside, and I understand if a lot of people aren't on right now. But thanks for joining us on our Science of Gar. So last week we talked about oh gosh, what did we talk about? We did corvids, we did flying squirrels. We've done a lot of different stuff. So now we're going to kind of shift gears onto the water. So we're going to talk about gar today. Just kind of the idea of these really cool creatures and their adaptations that they have, and then which species we have here in Nebraska too. So just as a preface for all of you, this is more of like a webinar as far as their evolutionary history, their biology, their adaptations. It's not a webinar about how to go gar fishing or how to catch gar. So just letting everybody know. But let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen with all of you. And we're going to talk about gar. All right. All right, so here we are. We're going to go ahead and talk about this really cool. We have 2 species in Nebraska, but we are going to highlight all the other species in North America today and kind of talk about, as a collective unit, what adaptations they have and the very cool habitats that they live in and very interesting things that they can do and their scales that they have. They're very neat. So even though we don't have a very big diversity of gar in Nebraska, that doesn't mean that the species that we do have are not special or not cool. So let's go ahead and get started. If you do have questions, well, I'll get to that in a second here. All right, so just letting everybody know, we do have the right to remove you. I want you to ask questions. I want you to make comments, but please make sure that you're commenting on the topic at hand and that we are kind to everyone. Otherwise, we do have that right to remove you. I also want to point out that I am not a gar expert by any means, but I do a ton of research. I am an outdoor education specialist, so I'm that science communicator side. So I take and disseminate this information into the public. If you ask me questions that I don't know the answers to, I will do my best to find out someone that can answer those questions for you. If you are looking for someone to teach you how to go gar fishing, we do have an entire fisheries division that is very good at their job. If any of you know Daryl Bauer, he would probably be the person I would talk to about where to go gar fishing and how to gar fish. But today we're going to be talking more about the science behind these creatures. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I also want to preface, it was very hard to find good photos of gar. So I did my best to find photos. But you may see some repeats because there's only so many good photos. So, all right, let's go ahead and talk about what are these creatures. So there's not a ton of them in North America. There's about 7 species here in North America. They're mostly found on the eastern side of the country and into Central America, all the way from Quebec in Canada to Costa Rica. And then they are also found in Cuba. These are usually pretty large fish, and they also are in a special family. I cannot pronounce this, but that is the family. So they are in this family. There's about 7 of them, like I mentioned. They are related to bowfin fishes, if any of you are familiar with those. They're mostly confined to freshwater when you do find them. However, there are some species that are kind of tend to descend into that brackish water, or the water that's kind of salty but kind of fresh, or even some species have been found in salt water. So they're kind of a diversity about where you find them. But overall, they have these very long kind of dart-shaped bodies. They're very thin, and they get their name gar because of their very long snout with their teeth. And then they also kind of like the slow moving water. Sometimes a lot of people like to call them stagnant bodies of water. They're usually sometimes hypoxic, which just means that there's very little oxygen in the water. We'll talk about that because we do know that fish need oxygen to survive in the water. So how do they live in those areas that a lot of other fish cannot live in? We'll talk about that here. They can get very large. Even here in Nebraska, we have the Longnose Gar, which is pretty large. It's nothing like the alligator gar, however. We do not have those in Nebraska, but those can reach about 3 meters in length, which is crazy. That's a huge fish. All right. Why are they called gar? So the Anglo-Saxon word gar means spear, and we can kind of understand with the spear-like snout that they have. So that kind of goes back to their long fish kind of spear-like appearance that they have. And then that genus name, the Lepisostis, It contains the Greek word lepis, which means scale, and that osteon, which means bone. So we'll talk a little bit here about their scales. They have what are called ganoid scales or ganoid scales, and they kind of interlock with each other, which is very different than a lot of other fish. For instance, like a carp is always a good example. They kind of overlap on each other. These are kind of like those vinyl floors where they interlock like a puzzle. So these animals are very neat and they're very primitive. So they're very kind of an old type animal. All right, so physical description, what do they look like? So in their habitats, they frequently bask on like logs at the surface. So when a lot of people or anglers see them, they don't even know that they're seeing gar. They look like logs. They also have this ability to gulp air. So very similar to how if you swim in a pool, you have to go up and take a breath. Very similar to like how whales do this or dolphins will do this. But they're able to live in these low oxygen conditions. Sometimes even people call them these sluggish kind of waters. A lot of people in Louisiana see them. There is a Louisiana gar, and a lot of times they see them in the bayous or in the estuaries out there. They also are able to do this because they have something like a primitive lung. So they do have gills, very similar to a lot of other fish, but they have this very unique ability where they can gulp air right out of the air, not necessarily in that water, that dissolved oxygen. And then their bodies are encased in this armor. So when you look and break their scales down, they're diamond shaped. And like I mentioned earlier, they have very thick or ganoid scales is what they are called. All right, so here is a video of a gar in case you've never seen one, you don't know what they look like. There is no sound, so if you're waiting for sound, there's nothing there. This kind of gives you a good kind of, just a quick overview of what these fish look like. And then the other fish got in the way and photobombed it. But this is what a gar looks like. And if you look very closely, you can see those scales are interlocking with each other. All right, so where did they come from? So they are the oldest member of this family, and there have been fossils that have been discovered in Mexico that date to about 157 million years ago. So they've been around quite a while. A lot of times in biology, we hear this word called an living fossil. A lot of animals, like a sturgeon, is considered a living fossil. They haven't changed a lot in the time that they've been around, and they have very primitive abilities. So this is one of those groups of fish that kind of fall into that era. And then during the Eocene epoch, which was about 56 to 33.9 million years ago, there has been evidence of gars living in Europe, North America, and even Asia as well. There's been fossils found in lots of those different places. And then looking at people and gar, about 450 million years ago, we have found that we shared a common ancestor. So this was a long time ago, but both of our species, humans and gar, they have evolved at a very slow pace compared to some of the other organisms on the planet. And people have been using genome sequencing and DNA reconstruction, trying to figure out how those ancestors are related. And because we have evolved at such a slow rate, and same with gar, it makes that research a lot easier to compare those results between gar and humans. So there was a common ancestor. We sometimes call them a LUCA, the least universal common ancestor, which we scientists believe that all living things came from. But at one point, about 450 million years ago, gar and people shared a common ancestor, which is kind of interesting. All right, there's also an article back in July of 2023, there was kind of some new evidence that came out that there was a new species of this ancient gar that they believe lived in a marine environment. So they weren't always a freshwater species. They believe that they pretty much thrived in a marine or an ocean-like environment about 66 million years ago. They believe this fish that they found, it was about 1 meter long, and it was the first complete specimen described from that Cretaceous marine deposit. So when they found it, this provided very compelling evidence that gars were likely to be fully marine. And then over time in the late Jurassic, they kind of switched to that freshwater environment. So looking at this fossil, it also supports the idea that gar kind of adapted later to a freshwater environment. So the fossil was found actually in Morocco, which, if you know, that's in Africa, and it's a little bit different from North America or Europe or Asia. So they believe that they kind of originated here, and this fossil gave huge insight to this marine environment that they believe they started in. And then this particular specimen, instead of having a very long shaped snout like a gar that we think today, it was kind of unusually short, and it was kind of compared to the length of their head. Usually gar have that elongated snout, and then the shape of their jaw kind of suggested that they believed that this animal, long time ago, ate turtles and it ate crabs. So very different than the insect larvae or things that a gar would eat today. All right, their scales. I think, did I skip? No, okay. So their scales are very interesting. Like I mentioned earlier, they have these things called ganoid scales. So if you look up types of scales, and I think I have a picture here in a second, but they have these very specialized scales that almost act like body armor. So they're very hard. They're diamond or kind of a rhombus shape, and they don't overlap each other. So when we talk about scales and how they overlap, like in a carp, they appear to overlap, but the idea is that they link together. And there's 3 layers to these ganoid scales. It's not just like a piece of paper that's on them. There's layers, like an onion. So there's a bone layer, which is called that inner layer. And then dentin is the middle. And then the ganine is the outside area, and that's the outside of the scale. It's very similar to the enamel that's like on your teeth. It's made of a crystalline mineral coating, and it makes it very, very hard. So again, just like your teeth have that enamel on them, that is what makes those scales very hard. And it's the layers of each scale. And then, like I mentioned earlier, that diamond, kind of a rhombus shape, but they're called articulating peg and socket joints between them. And so it's also been found in a lot of fossilized fish. Again, these are very primitive animals. So that's something that's very common with a lot of fish that were around long time ago. And then these animals, people have kind of taken this idea of these ganoid scales, this hard protective layer, and they've kind of used them for breastplate armor, for arrowheads. Some people even have used them in luggage, and they even cover the blades of wooden plows with them. So when people kind of use something in nature to make it easier for us, we call that biomimicry. So we're mimicking something in nature that is helpful for us as well. All right, so here's some different types of scales. Depending on who you talk to, there's 4 different types of scales. If you look at the ganoid scales, it's that bottom left over here, which is like on a gar. If you notice the other scales, they kind of overlap. There's spaces between them. Sharks are very interesting and different, but those ganoid scales, there's no space between them. So they lock in place, and they're that diamond shape or that rhombus kind of shape over here. So very different than a lot of other fish scales that you would see, like a bluegill or a catfish, or sorry, no catfish, but a bluegill or like a carp or something like that. All right, also thinking about the inside of their body, their skeletal system. So it's an ancient family of fish. And when you look at their scales, or when you look at their skeleton, it is not necessarily all bone. They have a lot of cartilage in there instead of bone, but if you've ever actually eaten a gar, there are bones that you still have to worry about, but a great deal of their skeletal system is actually made of cartilage. So very similar to people, our nose and our ears. It's a flexible, more flexible kind of substance than our actual bones in our body. And then also their vertebrae are kind of different color or different shapes as well. So when you look at them, they're, the anterior side is going to be convex and the posterior side is concave. If you don't know what this means, I will show you a photo. But what it does have in common is this type of vertebrae, the shape of the vertebrae is actually very common in reptiles. So reptiles and gar are very different from each other, but they have the same type of vertebrae. It's found in no other fish except those in the Semi-noniformes order. So it's only a special group that has the shape of a vertebrae. So here's what I'm talking about when I say this. So it is the very top right, this one. So if you look at their shape of their vertebrae, it's a lot different than all these other animals. So there's the mammals, there's birds, snakes are over here. This is actually pretty similar with turtles. And so looking at them, we kind of maybe understand that they also had a common ancestor a long time ago. So this would be the front of their vertebrae, the back, and then what that side portion looks like. So very different. And then if you look all the way to the top left, you see one that's very common in other types of fish, very different than what a gar looks like. So having those different types of vertebrae is very unique to a gar species. All right. If you're familiar with fish, you know that they move throughout the water column. Most of them determines because of their swim bladder. So this is like a special, basically like a balloon in their body that they're able to fill with air if they want to move up in the water column, or kind of take some of that air out if they want to move down. So they're able to do this. A lot of fish have this. Not every fish has a swim bladder, but most do. And so they are able to have this very, very similar specialized vascular swim bladder. So it's connected to their pharynx by this thing called a pneumatic duct. They still have gills like a normal fish, but this helps them supplement their gill respiration, and it also helps them with their buoyancy. We also talked earlier about them being able to gulp air. This also helps them. It's called facultative breathing or air breathing. So basically what they will do is in areas, they've kind of found their niche. So they find areas that are very low oxygen or dissolved oxygen or poorly oxygenated areas. And what they will do is they found their niche. They can survive in those areas where a lot of other fish cannot. And what they will do is they will come to the surface, they'll gulp some air, and then they'll come back down and breathe. So because of that, they have very little competition. Not that they have a lot anyway, because they are pretty much a predator, an apex predator. That scales and that armor really help with that. But they don't really have any more competition in their areas because they're able to live in such low oxygenated areas. So, which is really interesting. A lot of fish would die if they're in those areas, but we call it obligate air breathing. So out of those 30,000 plus species of fish that are on Earth, about 2% of them are known as air breathers, and gar are one of those 2%. So they live in those areas for that competition. There are some other species that can survive in there, littler species, but as far as large species like this gar, they're not really going to have any competition. So it's very unique and interesting to a gar. It's one of those special adaptations that they have. All right, so something else a lot of people know about is their teeth. When you look at a gar, you think teeth. That very long snout has a lot of teeth in it. So they are born with their teeth, and they're most of the time the fry species, or the fry are going to be the tiny little baby gar is what we call them. They're born with teeth, and so they can feed themselves right away. The growth of the teeth is almost immediate, and then the gar are going to be strict carnivores, so no really plant material at all. They eat lots of other little fish or insects, things like that. They also eat other fish, and they have teeth that are specially adapted for foraging. So they have, they're designed to puncture, basically. This helps them feed on really small organisms, sometimes microscopic organisms, worms, tiny crustaceans, insects. Basically, they fit their dietary lifestyle like a lot of other animals. Same with people. We don't need these teeth because we're not really catching our food and holding it in place. So the idea of gar, they don't really chew their food, but it's simply to grasp hold of their fish, and then over time they will work it down head first into their body, and then they will swallow it. They also have 3 categories of teeth, very similar to people. They have canines, molars, and incisors, which looking at that, you would never think they do. But they do not have permanent teeth. So they are constantly being replaced. Sometimes they grow in the base of the old teeth. When the old one falls out, the new one's already there ready to come up, or sometimes even between the two spaces of teeth that are already there. There's not really a rhyme or reason, they just grow. So looking at their teeth, they are called villiform teeth. So gar of all species, regardless if they're in Nebraska or not, they have tiny villiform teeth that they will use to catch and hold fish in their jaws while they maneuver them until they can get that fish to go head first down their throat. So using these teeth, it's very difficult to count them. They're very thin. Sometimes they look like brush bristles, especially as you get closer to the throat. They get really hard to count and they constantly are being replaced. So it's very difficult to tell how many teeth a gar will have, but we can tell that they have a lot. All right, so the three types of teeth that they have. Canines, very similar to people, and lots of other mammal species will have these as well, but these are going to be the very large teeth that are consistent with a carnivore. So these are teeth that are really going to grasp and grab onto things. When we think of canine teeth, they're going to look very different in a gar than to a person. They kind of serve the same function, but overall the shape, the size are going to be very different. These for them are going to be used to pierce and to grip their prey. They do have teeth like molars. Again, they're going to look very different between my teeth and their teeth, but they're flat and they're kind of used for crushing and grinding that food. In their jaws, they're pretty spaced out on both of their jaws, the top and the bottom. And sometimes there's two or three that are really close together, but sometimes the rest are farther apart. Again, there's not really a rhyme or reason to their teeth, they just grow. And then incisors. So gar come in a variety of shapes and sizes, everything from like the short-nose gar, like we have in Nebraska, to the gar, like the alligator gar that gets 3 meters long. So they have lots of different variety of shapes, such as the shape of that saw edge on their mouth. And then they use their incisors to cut up their prey instead of swallowing it whole. So some species are more of the whole swallowing, and some species are a little bit more of the piercing and the gripping and the chewing. So these are the three different types of teeth that fish, especially those gar, are going to have. All right, so habitat. They can pretty much live anywhere. However, their primitive swim bladder is connected to their throat. So again, that helps them a lot of times with that air gulping. But normally they are found in slow, very calm pools in places like rivers and streams, but not really a fast-moving water species. They use vegetation and branches a lot of the time as cover. So that's something that's usually pretty preferred for them because they're ambushing their prey. They want to make sure that they're not seen, but also they can sit very still. We talked earlier about a lot of anglers, when they find gar, they're floating or basking up by the surface, and a lot of people think of them as logs, and they don't even know that they're gar species. But overall, very calm, slow pools. You can even find them here in Nebraska, and we'll talk about which species we have in a little bit. All right, so their food. They're predators. Looking at their teeth, we talked about their strict carnivores, and as far as they go, they are ambush predators. So these guys, they will lie very close near the surface of the water. They'll wait for a small fish to kind of come by or near them, and then they will quickly grab the fish and then swallow it head first. Young gar are going to eat a little bit smaller things, so insects, insect larvae, crustaceans, even small tiny fish. And then adults, they will eat a little bit larger fish, so fish like minnows. And remember, there's a lot of species in the minnow family. It's all not necessarily the tiny little fish. Minnows are just a family of fish. And then also small, what we call forage fish. All right, who eats them? So they have very few natural predators simply because of their body armor. They have all these teeth on them. So they don't have a lot of competition. A lot of scientists kind of call them the apex predators of their habitats simply because they don't have a lot of predators and they are a carnivore themselves. They do have some as a young gar. So they're very vulnerable, especially when they've just hatched. A lot of the times they will hook on or stick to plants, and they are very vulnerable during this time. So young gar have more predators, things like snapping turtles, herons, kingfishers, some snakes, larger fish will eat them. Adults aren't always safe. There's always something that could eat them. People are a pretty big predator of gar. There's a lot of anglers that think they are delicious to eat. However, there are bigger fish out there. The occasional heron is pretty good predator. This bird that I have a picture of, an osprey, or even an eagle is known to take gar as well. When you think of places like Florida, where there's always something bigger than the other animal. Alligator gar live in Florida. They can be eaten by alligators, crocodiles, and even smaller gar can be taken by water moccasins, or sometimes people call them cottonmouths, which we do not have here in Nebraska. I just want to point that out. All right, so how do these fish reproduce? So there's a spawning season. On average in North America, it's from early to mid-April until about the end of May. Females, like in a lot of species, are generally larger than the males, and so she will spawn with several males at once. Usually they have to wait for a water temperature of about 68 to 74 degrees, and then that triggers them to want to go to spawning. Basically, gar will congregate around the spawning area, and sometimes you will see a lot of them together at once. Those are usually the ones that are ready to breed. Once they have bred with each other, once they have reproduced with each other, they will hatch about 8 days later. So once the eggs are laid, they have about 8 days on average, and then they will hatch. The fry is what a baby gar is called. They attach themselves to an object. They have this adhesive structure, and they kind of just sit somewhere vertically until their yolk sac is absorbed. So we have a lot of trout in our office right now, getting ready for trout in the classroom in Nebraska. And it's really interesting because they're very vulnerable. They kind of just sit there, especially while they are absorbing that egg sac or that egg yolk. They're getting the last of the minerals and the nutrients from their sac, and then they will be ready to go on their own. Once this happens, the fry become more active. They can rest horizontally in the water column, and then they start being able to feed themselves. And even some of them will take those aerial breaths, or that air gulping that we talked about. All right. So gar eggs, some of you might have heard, they are poisonous to a lot of other animals. So a lot of humans, a lot of anglers, I personally have never eaten a gar. I'm not a huge fish person, but I know a lot of people will eat them, and they say that they're very delicious. So if you've eaten one, I have never tried it. If you think otherwise, go ahead and put it in the chat. But their eggs are actually poisonous. So do not eat those. Do not have gar caviar. But animals like humans, chickens, dogs, they are poisonous. So they have a special protein that is just very highly toxic to a lot of different types of animals, humans being one of them. If you do eat gar eggs, you're going to have vomiting, severe stomach pains. They're highly poisonous. So I would just suggest eating something else instead of gar eggs. All right, so once those eggs have hatched, the fry we talked about, they will sit somewhere, adhesive unit, until they're able to move in the water column. So as soon as the gar are out of their protective eggs, they are ready to go out on their own. A lot of times, like a lot of reptiles and a lot of amphibians as well, they're cannibals early in their life. So it's kind of that, survival of the fittest. If they get eaten, a lot of those animals are going to be cannibals when they kind of first start their lives. When they emerge from their eggs, they are a target for lots of different types of predators. So how do they go about kind of revising this solution? Is they grow really quickly and they grow really large. So the idea is their solution, instead of being a moving target so much, is to grow really fast and to get really big. There was a study done in Illinois that showed a 10-week-old gar had already measured 15 inches and weighed about 2 pounds. That's huge, just in those 10 weeks. But basically in the wild, it is not uncommon to see gar reaching about 12 inches, so the size of a ruler, in under 3 months. When you look at a salmon, we think of salmon being pretty large fish. It takes them about a year to reach that size, and gar can do it in about 3 months. So it's just another one of those techniques that these fish have kind of over time adapted so that they don't get eaten. And another reason why they're an apex predator as well. All right, so that was just a little bit about the gar species. We only have so much time in these webinars. There might have been a lot of things that I missed, but I do want to spend a little bit of time about the species that we have here in Nebraska. Also, just want to point out that species that I have in the photo is not one we have in Nebraska. It's just kind of the one that I've used through the whole PowerPoint here, but I will show you the ones that we have here in Nebraska. So Nebraska is home to 2 species. We have the Longnose Gar and the Shortnose Gar. So the Longnose Gar is defined because of their long nose. This should be pretty easy to recognize the 2 of them together. But the Longnose Gar, it's very narrow. So when you look at their snout, the narrowest width is less than 1/10 of the distance from the tip of the snout to the eye. So very, very, very small as far as their width. Their tail is rounded, and they do have this heterocircle fin. It's just simply not lobed like in a paddlefish or a sturgeon, for instance, but biologists still call it that heterocircle fin. All right, so their distribution, as far as the United States, they are found mostly in the eastern part, all the way south to northwestern Mexico. In Nebraska specifically, they have been collected from the Platte River all the way west to Dawson County, but primarily they are found in the eastern area of Nebraska. In southeastern Nebraska, for instance, they've been found in the Elkhorn, Republican, Little Blue River, Nemaha, and the Nemaha River Basin. So quite a few areas in Nebraska that you can find them. And then their natural history. So where do they live? They eat primarily fish. This is the thing that they just happen to be in Nebraska. When we talk about Shortnose Gar here in a little bit, they're not as picky and they're a little bit more opportunistic than these Longnose Gar. But Longnose Gar, primarily fish is their diet. When they feed, these guys will slowly drift up alongside their prey, and then all of a sudden they will make the swift sideways snap at the fish, and then it's followed by a series of 1 or 2 like short biting motions, basically trying to orient that fish to swallow it head first, like we've seen in a lot of other species. These guys are going to be most active at dark, so they're those nocturnal fishes. And then the spawning will occur in shallow water over algae or sometimes different rooted plants. And it's kind of interesting as far as gar species go. They spawn over different types of substrate. So the longnose gar will be over algae or those rooted plants, but you're going to notice here in a little bit that the shortnose gar likes something totally different. So their reproduction, each female is accompanied by 1 or several males. She lies quietly on a riffle, basically cruises around a slow nearby pool, and the male will mate with her. The female will not deposit all of her eggs in one place. That just wouldn't be smart. And the spawning act basically is repeated at widely spaced and kind of irregular intervals. So she will have lots of eggs. They frequently, all the individuals kind of in the vicinity, gather together, and what they will do is they will vibrate rapidly. A lot of the times they break the surface and they splash a lot, sometimes so noisily that they can be heard from a considerable distance. So very similar to like an Asian carp, when they vibrate, you will see them, or something like a boat goes by or something, they kind of jump out of the water. These guys will vibrate rapidly as they're spawning. All right, and then we have a short-nosed gar. So looking at the size of their nose is going to be very different. You can see in that long nose, they are very, very thin and small. These guys have a little bit more of a blunter nose. The least width of the snout only goes about 6 to 10 times to its length. So this animal is named after its short, broad nose. Looking at the species too, the coloring is a little different. They have kind of a brownish and olive color above on top of them. And then as you go to their belly, they're a little bit more white. And then those unpaired fins, they have a definite roundish black spot. So as you can see on their tail, they will have those spots on them. And then individuals, science has found that they're from clearer water, they're going to have more defined spots than the ones from murkier water, which makes sense because you're never going to see them. And then the young, when they're less than 10 inches long, they have a broad black stripe along the midside. So then you can tell if it's a juvenile versus an adult. All right, so their distribution is going to be a little different as well. They are found throughout much of the Mississippi and Missouri river systems and their major tributaries that they have. Here in Nebraska, they've been collected from the Missouri, Nemaha, Salt Creek, which is if you're from Lincoln or you know Salt Creek, you would never think you'd find a gar there. But again, that's stagnant, slow moving water. And then also the Platte River, same with the Longnose Gar, all the way as far west as Dawson County. And then these guys have been found all the far west to Montana, which is a little different too. All right, and then their natural history, kind of same thing. They're found in shallow backwaters, quiet pools of those warm rivers. The larvae of those young short-nosed gar do look similar to longnose. They have that mid-dorsal, kind of that mid-lateral stripe. But then what happens is it grays into that uniform gray color. So they're a little bit different in color. These guys spawn, we believe, between mid-May through July. And then the eggs, very similarly, will hatch about 8 days later. These guys, when they're little, and also into adulthood, they eat a little bit more of a generalized food. So they will eat fish, insects. They'll also sometimes have crustaceans, crayfish, in addition to those fish as well. So they're not just fish eaters like those longnose gar. They eat different types of food. And I think that was it. So, all right. So not a ton. We had a lot more information I'm sure we could cover, but again, we only have so much time. So next week, we are going to, again, switch gears. We're going to be talking about bighorn sheep. So next week, like I mentioned, earlier on this one, it's going to be more about their biology, their history, how we do those in Nebraska. I am going to cover a little bit about Nebraska and the pneumonia issues and the challenges we've had with our bighorn sheep, but it's not going to be a webinar about how to hunt them and the seasons and the regulations and things like that. It's more the biology side. So just kind of putting that out there. And then we have one more after that. We're going to finish on the 15th and we're going to talk about garter snakes. So it's warm enough today that I would not be surprised if you did see a garter snake out today. So be sure to look for those. If you really liked this and you want more, I mentioned earlier, we do record all of our webinars and we put them on our Nebraska Game and Parks Education YouTube channel. So we have lots of different things on there. We have nature nerd nights. We have things like nature journaling, how to tie knots, lots of different just educational videos for all of you. And then if you're interested, we do have a very active Facebook and Instagram page. You can find events, you can find more information or just kind of some fun facts about Nebraska. And then also our Nebraska Wildlife Education website as well. We have free downloadable things, educator workshops, PowerPoints, lots of good stuff. All right, so see everyone next week. We're going to be talking about bighorn sheep. I am going to back out of this and I think check the comments to see if we have anything. Someone mentioned they caught a gar. Oh gosh, sorry. Caught a gar up in Northeast Nebraska. Looking forward to hearing about them. Someone talked about betta fish are similar in that they breathe air. Yes, so very small amount, that 2% out of that 30,000-ish fish. Is there any creature that can eat their eggs? Yeah, I ran across some studies and it kind of depended, like bluegill and I think it was bass. They were fed gar eggs and nothing happened to them. So I don't know if it's just a certain type of animals like those chickens, those dogs, humans. I don't know if it's a mammal thing, but I did find a few studies that talked about bluegill and bass that were eating their eggs and fed their eggs and nothing happened to them. Okay, someone mentioned bluegills and catfish were fed. They remained healthy. Nothing happened to them. All right. Appreciate the info. Thank you. I'm not normally a fish person. This was very interesting. I'm not normally a fish person. This was very interesting. I will tell you, who is this? Diane. When I was in school, I was a fisheries and wildlife major. I did not like fish either. I'd always tell people I was just a wildlife major. And then I eventually had to learn about fish. And I find that the more you learn about them, the more interesting they do sound. And I do have a paddle sturgeon tattoo now, so I do love fish. They're the more that I learn about them, the more interesting they are. So I'm glad you learned a little bit about them. Someone said, so are we related to Gar? Kind of. 450 million years ago, we had that common ancestor. And if you go back even farther, there's that Luca, the least universal common ancestor. So, I mean, technically, yes, we are. We also share a lot of our DNA with a banana. So I don't know if we want to say we're bananas too. So it's kind of interesting, but yes, overall, when you break it down, there is that least universal common ancestor. Someone said, love the video. Great. I'm glad I'm able to show everyone some videos and get some good information. So, all right. So thanks everyone for joining us. Give me probably about till Monday. I got trivia and Carney tonight, but give me till Monday to get the video on here. I'll send you the link in an email, registration for next week as well, some resources, that kind of stuff. So, but hopefully we'll see everyone next week for bighorn sheep. So thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your week and weekend, and we will see you next Thursday. So thanks, everyone. Bye.